What if the land your ancestors walked for 10,000 years turned around and called you a stranger? Not with words, but with maps, measurements, microscopes, paper-stamped science. This is what happened to the Sami, Europe's last indigenous people, born from the ice, molded by the Arctic, rooted deep in north, were once erased not by war, but by theories. Cold, quiet, powerful theories. For most of the 20th century, textbooks and scientists painted them as outsiders. Asian stock, they said. Mongoloid features. They pointed to skull shapes, skin tone, language roots, building a case that the Sami didn't belong in Europe, that they'd come from somewhere else. And behind it all, maps. Strange, haunting diagrams, arrows flowing from Siberia, crossing frozen lakes and ancient forests, all ending in Sapmi, the Sami homeland, as if they had invaded, as if they were never truly home. But then came the DNA. Quietly, ancient bones began to whisper the truth. Mitochondrial lines stretching back into Ice Age Europe. Ancestral markers untouched by Indo-European migrations. Bloodlines older than borders. Genes that spoke not of exile, but of endurance. It shattered the narrative. Because the Sami weren't new arrivals. They were survivors. And suddenly, the question changed. Why had science worked so hard to say otherwise? Why erase a people's roots, if those roots were in the very ground your empire stood on? The twist isn't just biological, it's political. Because declaring someone foreign makes it easier to take their land, their language, their name. It's not just about DNA. It's about identity as weapon, science as colonizer. But this was just the beginning. Because after they questioned their blood, they went for their bones. And what they did next, you're not ready for. It looked like a hospital. White walls, cold instruments, a man in a clean lab coat, smiling, polite, scientific. But what happened inside was not medicine. It was measurement. The year was 1922. Sweden had just built something no other country dared, a government-funded institute for racial biology. A place where race wasn't just studied, it was designed. And at the center stood Herman Lundborg. He didn't carry a gun. He carried calipers. He didn't ask for your name. He asked for your skull width. And if you were Sami, he already knew what he wanted to find. Children were taken from schoolhouses, lined up like artifacts, told to strip, stand still, look forward. Their faces catalogued, their bodies compared, photographed in silence, often naked, as white men marked angles, curves, ratios. The data didn't ask permission. It assumed. They were labeled primitive, mixed, less evolved. Not based on crime or action, but on the slope of a nose, the color of an eye. To the world, it was science. To the Sami, it was a theft, not of blood, but of dignity. Craniometers, charts, skull samples stored in drawers, tagged like specimens. This wasn't discovery, it was design. A blueprint to prove one race superior by lowering another. And they weren't alone. This lab inspired others in Germany, across Europe. Eugenics was contagious, and Sweden had written the playbook. The worst part, they said it was for the future, for the health of the nation, for purity, for progress. But the truth? It was about control. And it was only beginning, because measuring heads wasn't enough. They wanted to collect them. And what they did next crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. They came at night, shovels in hand, boots sinking into soft earth. No prayers, no ceremony, just silence and a map of where the bodies were buried. In 1915, in the village of Nyden, 94 Sami graves were opened, not by grave robbers, but by scientists. Official, educated, respected. They didn't ask. They didn't wait. Locals begged them to stop, but the digging continued. Because to them, these weren't ancestors. They were data. Bones to be boxed. Skulls to be tagged. Souls to be removed. The remains of mothers, fathers, elders, stolen from sacred ground and shipped to universities as specimens. Stored in cabinets. Measured for racial purity. Compared for shape and size. Some still had beads, cloth, or wooden crosses. Personal items meant to guide the dead into the next world. None were returned. To the Sami, this wasn't science. It was a violation, deep, spiritual, generational. In their world, the dead must rest. To disturb a grave is to disturb the soul. It breaks a link between past and present, between the living and those who watch over them. But no one cared. To the men in the lab coats, these were not people. They were puzzle pieces in a racist theory. Pieces they needed to prove the Sami were not native, not European, not worthy. They wrapped the skulls in cloth, packed them in crates, sent them to Oslo, to Uppsala, to Copenhagen, labeled them with numbers instead of names. And in the quiet of museum basements, the ancestors waited to be seen again, waited to be returned. But the story gets darker, because after they stole them, they didn't keep them. They began to trade the skulls, like collectibles. It wasn't just theft. It was a trade. After the graves were emptied, after the skulls were boxed, something even darker began. They started to swap them. Across Europe, universities built secret collections of indigenous remains. Not to honor them, not to protect them, but to barter. A Sami skull for an Inuit one. A skeleton from Norway, exchanged for a pelvis from Greenland. And in the middle of it, the most chilling deal of all. A Slack Jacobson Hedda. A Sami leader. A rebel. In 1852, he stood against the system, against forced religion, forced silence, forced loss. They executed him, beheaded him, and then they didn't bury him. They sent his skull to Oslo, but it didn't stay. Just 4 years later, it was shipped to Copenhagen, traded away, like a collector's coin, in exchange for 2 Inuit skulls, as if his rebellion had made him more valuable, as if resistance could be priced. The universities said it was science, but science doesn't use people as currency. What kind of knowledge begins with stolen graves? What kind of truth is built on broken spirits? These were not nameless artifacts. They were people, with families, stories, songs. But in the hands of Europe's finest institutions, they became inventory. Filed, stored, forgotten, until someone opened a drawer and read a label. Hedda, Cranium 8. That's how he was remembered. Not as a freedom fighter. Not as a father. Just a skull. In a swap. Between men in suits. But this wasn't just one man's fate. Because what happened to Hedda unlocked something much bigger. One rebellion. One beheading. And a posthumous betrayal. Kadokino, 1852. 2 men stood in the snow, eyes steady, hands bound. Their names were Aslak Hedda and Man Sambi. Sami leaders. Rebels. They had dared to say no to priests, to power, to a system that crushed their people. For that, they were executed. But death wasn't the end. Their heads were taken, not by grave robbers, not by enemies, by scientists, sent to Oslo, to be examined, weighed, dissected, their skulls placed on display, like objects of curiosity. The final insult, turned from leaders into exhibits. They called it anthropology. They called it research. But for the Sami, it was desecration. For over 140 years, their remains sat in boxes beneath the university. No burial, no ceremony, no names on the lid, just numbers, just specimens. And then, something shifted. In the 1990s, descendants began to ask questions. Loud ones. Where are they? Why are they still here? Why weren't they brought home? The fight wasn't easy. Institutions delayed. Officials resisted. Papers were lost. But the voices didn't stop. Not this time. And in 1997, they won. The skulls of Aslak and Mons were returned to Sapmi. A sacred reburial was held in Kafjord. Drums beat softly. Earth was broken. Prayers rose like smoke into the sky. It was quiet. It was heavy. It was right. For the first time in generations, they were home. But this story has no ending. Because while those 2 skulls found peace, hundreds more did not. The rest are still waiting in boxes. It didn't end with the skulls. Even now, in clean labs, under soft fluorescent lights, the taking continues. But this time it's quieter. Legal. Sanitized. A tube of blood. A cheek swab. A signature scribbled on a clipboard. Across the Sami homeland, DNA is still being collected. Studied. Filed. But look closely, and you'll see something strange. The samples aren't labeled Sami. They're called Kariswando. Northern Finland. Arctic population. On paper, it's just geography. But behind that label hides a people. By avoiding the word Sami, researchers bypass oversight, bypass consent. They study ethnicity without ever naming it. And that's no accident. Because if they admitted Sami DNA, they'd have to ask the Sami first. Instead, the data flows into biobanks, into journals, into labs around the world. And the communities it came from? They're left out. No results shared. No voices heard. No power to say no. This isn't just about research. It's about control. About who owns the story written in blood. And for the Sami, it feels all too familiar. They say, we are not test subjects. We are people. With names. With memory. With pain. Because every sample taken without respect reopens an old wound. A reminder that their ancestors were measured, buried, traded. And now, their descendants are being sequenced, studied, published. Different tools. Same silence. And in this new war, the enemy wears a lab coat, not a uniform. Imagine a vault. Solid steel, sealed tight, guarded not by money, but by memory. Now imagine the opposite, a server farm. Endless rows of blinking lights. No doors. No locks. Just open access. Free for anyone, but not for the people it came from. That's the battle. Not over bones this time, but over bytes. Because in today's world, DNA doesn't just live in blood. It lives in code, files, databases, systems that move faster than any border. And for the Sami, that's dangerous. For years, researchers collected their genetic data, labeled it vaguely, stored it globally, shared it freely, without ever asking should they. Now the Sami are answering. They call it Indigenous Data Sovereignty, IDS, a revolution of the invisible, a way to say, this is our code, our history, our choice. No more samples taken without full consent. No more studies written without community voices. No more data used to benefit everyone, except the people it came from. The Sami-Parliament is pushing back, fighting not just for bones to be buried, but for genomes to be protected. And yet, resistance is fierce. Western science calls it open access. A noble idea on the surface. Knowledge for all. Transparency. Progress. But open for who? When a community can't stop the use of its own DNA, is it open or is it theft? Some scientists say gatekeeping data is unethical. But they don't live with the history. They don't carry the grief. Because when your ancestors were once stolen, open doors don't feel generous. They feel like the same wound, in a different century. The Sami aren't saying no to research. They're saying yes, but on their terms, with their laws, with their keys. The question now isn't about access. It's about power. And the real test is still to come. Because can old institutions learn to share power they were built to hoard? It was raining in Lixiel. Soft, steady, like the sky itself was mourning. A small crowd gathered near the trees. Elders in traditional dress. Children holding flowers. And in the center, a simple wooden box. Inside, the skulls of 25 Sami ancestors. Stolen over a century ago. Measured. Labeled. Stored in museum drawers as samples. Now finally coming home. As the earth was opened, and each skull lowered into the soil, people wept. Not loud. Just a quiet, aching grief. For time lost, for names forgotten, for prayers that were never said. They sang songs the dead would have known. Lit fires to guide the spirits back. It was not closure. It was reconnection. But step back, and the bigger picture breaks your heart. Because while these 25 found peace, hundreds more remain trapped. In basements, in archives, in cardboard boxes, tagged with numbers. Tags that read Unknown Sami. Unknown because someone removed their names. Unknown because someone decided they didn't need identity to be studied. Walk through those halls, and you'll see them. Shelf after shelf. Clean. Cold. Silent. Waiting. Some universities promise repatriation. Some stay quiet. Some say the science must go on. But the Sami know. It's not science if it begins in silence. And no ceremony, no apology. No law can undo what was done, but returning is a start. Still, the pace is slow. Bureaucracy moves like winter ice. And each year, more elders pass, never seeing their ancestors returned. Because for every skull reburied, 10 more remain boxed. One burial is not justice, and memory cannot rest while bones remain stolen. For over 100 years, they were studied, photographed, measured, dug up, filed away, and not once were they asked. But in 2024, something changed. In Finland, a new document appeared. Just a few pages long, but centuries in the making. Ethical guidelines for research on the Sami. Not written by outsiders. Written with Sami hands. Sami voices. Sami pain. For the first time, the rules didn't come from the top down. They rose from the ground, from land, from language, from memory. Now, if you want to study the Sami, you ask them. Not just once. Not just on paper. You speak their language. You listen to their leaders. You wait until they say yes. Because this isn't just about science anymore. It's about dignity. No more collecting DNA like it's soil. No more treating stories like statistics. The new rule is simple. Research must be shared, understood, and led by the people it's about. And that shifts everything. Suddenly, the Sami aren't subjects. They're co-authors. They decide what matters, what's sacred, what stays private. In labs across the north, scientists are learning a new rhythm. Slower, deeper, human. This isn't the old way, where knowledge was taken. This is collaboration. And for the Sami, it's power. Not just to protect, but to choose. Because after years of being watched, they're watching back. Still, something lingers. Because documents can be signed. Meetings can be held. Policies can be drafted. But healing? Healing is not policy. It's personal. They said the Sami were weak, primitive, a fading people with no past, and no place in Europe's future. But the truth was buried deep, not in the ground this time, but in the blood. When scientists finally looked closer, truly looked, they didn't find broken lineage. They found something else. A genetic signature older than most of Europe. Mitochondrial lines, stretching back 10,000 years. A people who endured ice ages, invasions, forced silence, and still carried the same markers, generation after generation. It wasn't a story of fragility. It was survival, written in code. Imagine a mother rocking her child beside a fire. She hums a song her own mother once sang. A lullaby passed down with the language, the rhythm, the warmth, and the DNA. Her story, her song, her blood, all survive. Even when the maps change. Even when the names are erased. That's the heartbreak. Because the very thing they used to shame the Sami, the shape of a skull, the color of a gene, now proves their endurance. Their right to be here. Their place in the oldest story this land can tell. But the hardest story isn't in the lab. It's in the silence. In the schools where Sami children were beaten for speaking their language. In the museums where their ancestors' bones waited in drawers. In the families who never knew their names were taken, until they saw them on a tag. Because some truths were never lost, they were buried. Not just from the earth, but from memory. So what does it mean when your very DNA becomes a battlefield for your identity? If you believe lost histories deserve to be told, subscribe and join us for the next story.